The moment I saw them standing too close in my kitchen, speaking in whispers that stopped the second I stepped in, I realized something in my life had already ended, and neither of them thought I was smart enough to notice. I didn't ask questions. I didn't raise my voice. I simply smiled, the same polite smile I had worn for over 40 years of marriage, and I reached for a glass from the cabinet as if nothing had shifted beneath my feet. Richard barely looked at me, just cleared his throat and picked up his keys, mumbling something about needing to run an errand, while Vanessa stayed behind, leaning casually against the counter like she belonged there more than I did. "You look tired, Margaret," she said, her voice soft, almost sweet, but her eyes were measuring, calculating. I nodded. "Just didn't sleep well?" I replied, my tone even, my hand steady as I filled the glass with water. That was the first moment I understood the game they thought they were playing. And more importantly, I understood that they believed I wasn't even a player. Dinner that night felt like a performance rehearsed without me. The table was set the way I had always set it. Linen placemats, polished silverware, the good plates reserved for Sundays. But something invisible had taken my seat long before I sat down. Vanessa spoke easily, laughing at things that weren't funny, reaching across Richard in a way that felt just slightly too familiar. He didn't pull away. He didn't correct it. He just let it happen, as if the boundaries that had once defined our family had quietly dissolved. I watched them the way you watch a storm rolling in from a distance, knowing it will reach you but not yet feeling the rain. "We should talk about the house," Richard said halfway through dinner, cutting into his steak without looking up. His tone was casual, almost bored, like he was discussing the weather. I placed my fork down carefully. "What about it?" I asked. Vanessa answered instead. "It's just a lot for one person," she said, tilting her head with practiced concern. "Maintenance, property taxes, all that space." I nodded slowly, as if I were considering something new, something reasonable. But inside, pieces were already locking into place. This wasn't concern. This was positioning. This was the beginning of something they had already planned. Long before I walked into that kitchen earlier. "I've managed it just fine so far," I said calmly, lifting my glass and taking a sip. Richard finally looked at me then, but there was no warmth in his eyes, no hesitation, just impatience. "That's exactly the point," he replied. "So far." The word lingered in the air like a quiet threat. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I simply nodded again and continued eating, even though I could no longer taste a single bite. Because in that moment, I understood something they didn't expect me to understand. They thought they were preparing me for a conversation. What they didn't realize was that I had already heard everything they weren't saying. And I had already decided I would let them believe I hadn't. The next morning, I woke up before sunrise the way I always had, out of habit more than necessity, and for a few quiet seconds, everything felt normal until I remembered that nothing in my house belonged to the version of my life I thought I was still living. The kitchen was still, untouched, the air carrying that faint scent of last night's dinner, but something about it felt different now, like I was standing in a place that had already been claimed by someone else. I moved slowly, deliberately, reaching for the coffee maker, measuring out the grounds with steady hands, refusing to let even the smallest movement betray the shift happening inside me. Outside the window, the sky was just beginning to lighten, soft gray turning into pale blue, and for a moment, I let myself watch it, the way I used to when things were simple, when mornings meant routine instead of realization. But that version of me had already ended sometime between the whisper I overheard and the silence that followed. I heard footsteps behind me before I saw her, light, unhurried, completely at ease. Vanessa walked into the kitchen wearing one of Richard's old sweaters, the sleeves pushed up, her hair loosely tied back, as if she had every right to be there at that hour, as if nothing about this was unusual. She smiled when she saw me, that same careful smile she used when she wanted to appear thoughtful. "You are up early," she said, opening the refrigerator without asking, scanning its contents like she was taking inventory. I nodded, pouring coffee into 2 mugs out of habit before I stopped myself and set one aside. She noticed. Of course she did. "You do not have to make one for me," she added lightly, though she did not step away. I slid the extra mug toward her anyway. I already did, I said, my voice even almost pleasant. She hesitated for a fraction of a second before taking it, and in that small pause, I saw it clearly. Not guilt, not shame, just calculation. Richard came down a few minutes later, adjusting his watch, already dressed like he had somewhere to be that did not include me. He kissed Vanessa on the cheek without thinking. A quick, careless gesture that would have gone unnoticed by anyone who was not paying attention. But I was paying attention now. To everything. He froze for half a second after it happened, as if remembering I was there, but he did not apologize. He did not explain. He simply moved on, grabbing his keys from the counter. I have a meeting this morning, he said, not looking at me, his tone flat, rehearsed. I nodded, sipping my coffee, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make it uncomfortable before I spoke. Of course you do. Vanessa set her mug down, her eyes flicking between us, measuring the space, the tension, the things left unsaid. They were both waiting for something, a reaction, a question, a sign that I had noticed. I gave them nothing, because what they did not understand yet was that silence is not the absence of action. It is the beginning of it. And while they were busy pretending nothing had changed, I was already beginning to see exactly how far this had gone, and more importantly, how far they were planning to take it. I did not follow Richard that morning, and I did not check his phone or search for answers in places that would only give me pieces of something I already understood, because by then I knew that the truth was not hidden in secrets. It was sitting openly in the way they moved around me, in the way decisions were being made without my voice, in the way my home had begun to feel like a place I was temporarily allowed to stay instead of a life I had built. Instead, I did something far simpler. I opened the hallway closet and reached for the small lockbox I had not touched in years. The one Richard always said was unnecessary because everything important was already taken care of. I set it on the dining table and sat down slowly, running my fingers over the surface for a moment before opening it, as if I needed to prepare myself not for what I would find, but for what it would confirm. Inside were documents I had once trusted without question, property records, bank summaries, copies of agreements I had signed over decades of marriage, all neatly organized, all familiar, and yet suddenly distant, like they belonged to a version of me who believed that trust did not need verification. I began reading carefully, line by line, not rushing, not reacting, just observing, the way I had learned to do over the past 24 hours. It did not take long to notice the changes. Small things at first. A name added where there had only been one. A clause adjusted in language subtle enough to avoid immediate concern but clear enough once you knew what to look for. Transfers scheduled. Permissions granted. Not recently either. Some of them dated back months. That was when I understood that what I had witnessed in my kitchen was not the beginning of anything. It was simply the moment I had finally seen it. I closed the folder gently and sat back in my chair, letting the quiet of the house settle around me, not as comfort, but as confirmation. Every memory I had dismissed over the past year began to rearrange itself. Conversations that ended too quickly when I entered the room, financial discussions that I was told I did not need to worry about, the gradual shift from partnership to exclusion that I had explained away as age, as change, as anything other than what it truly was. I stood up and walked into the living room, taking in the space with new eyes, the furniture I had chosen, the photographs I had framed, the life I had believed was shared, all of it now carrying a different weight. This was never about a single betrayal. It was about a plan that had been unfolding quietly, patiently, counting on one simple assumption, that I would not notice until it was too late. I glanced at the clock on the wall, noting the time Richard had said he would be in his meeting. And for the first time, I allowed myself a small, controlled exhale, not of sadness, not of anger, but of clarity. Because now I knew exactly what they were doing. And more importantly, I knew exactly where they thought I stood in all of it. They believed I was behind them. They believed I was unaware. They believed I was already losing. And that was the only reason they were going to lose everything. By the time Richard returned that afternoon, I had already placed every document back exactly where it belonged, every paper aligned, every drawer closed, every trace of my discovery erased so completely that even I could almost believe nothing had changed. And that was the point, because the moment you let people know you see them clearly is the moment they begin to hide again, and I needed them comfortable, careless, certain that I was still exactly who they thought I was. He walked in with the same distracted energy, setting his keys down on the counter, loosening his tie as if the day had been long and uneventful, as if nothing in his world required caution. Vanessa was already there, sitting at the kitchen island, scrolling through her phone, her posture relaxed, her presence steady in a way that no longer felt temporary. "You are home early," I said, not looking up from the recipe book I had opened in front of me, even though I had not turned a single page. "Meeting ended sooner than expected," he replied, pouring himself a drink without asking if I wanted one, without even glancing in my direction. That, more than anything, told me how far this had gone. Not the secrecy, not the quiet conversations, but the absence of effort, the assumption that I no longer needed to be considered. Vanessa looked up then, her expression warm, practiced, effortless. "We were just talking about dinner," she said. "I thought maybe we could order something tonight. Give you a break." I smiled slightly, closing the recipe book and setting it aside. "That sounds nice," I said, my voice calm, agreeable, exactly what they expected. And just like that, the room shifted. The tension eased. The air lightened. They relaxed. Because in their minds, I had accepted the new arrangement without question. I watched them move around each other as they discussed takeout options, their conversation flowing easily, decisions made between them without hesitation, without pause, as if I were no longer part of the equation but simply present within it. It was subtle, almost invisible if you were not paying attention, but I was paying attention now to everything. The way Vanessa answered questions directed at both of us. The way Richard deferred to her without realizing it. The way they spoke in tones that suggested familiarity built over time, not something new or uncertain. This had not started recently. This had been growing quietly, steadily, long before I allowed myself to see it. When the food arrived, we ate together at the table, the same table that had once held conversations, decisions, shared moments that felt balanced and mutual, and now it felt like I was sitting across from two people who had already agreed on a future that did not include me in any meaningful way. "We should finalize things soon," Richard said suddenly, placing his fork down as if the timing of the conversation had been carefully chosen. I looked up, meeting his eyes for just a second before nodding. "If that is what you think is best," I replied. Vanessa remained quiet, but I could feel her attention sharpen, her posture shift slightly, the anticipation controlled but present. They were waiting for resistance, for hesitation, for anything that would complicate what they had already planned. I gave them none, because the truth was, I no longer needed to resist them. I only needed them to keep believing that I would not. The next few days unfolded with a precision that would have impressed me if I had not been the one quietly studying every move, every word, every carefully timed conversation that now made perfect sense when viewed from the angle they never expected me to take. I did not rush. I did not confront. Instead, I adjusted. I began waking earlier, not out of habit this time, but with purpose, giving myself hours of silence before either of them entered the kitchen. Hours where the house still felt like it belonged to me, where I could think clearly without the distraction of their performance. I made small changes that no one would notice. I reviewed accounts online instead of waiting for statements. I read every document fully instead of trusting summaries. I paid attention to dates, signatures, permissions that had once seemed routine but now revealed a pattern that was anything but accidental. There were transfers scheduled that I had never approved directly, adjustments made under joint authority that I had assumed was balanced but now understood had been tilted carefully over time. Not in one dramatic move, but in a series of small, quiet steps designed to go unnoticed until the final step made everything irreversible. That was their plan. Not to take everything at once, but to move pieces slowly until I was standing in a position where I had already lost without realizing it. I sat at the desk in the study one morning, the same desk where Richard used to handle our finances with a sense of shared responsibility, and I opened a folder labeled Estate Review, something he had mentioned casually weeks ago as a routine update. Inside, I found drafts, not finalized, not signed, but detailed enough to show intention. Language that shifted ownership, clauses that redefined control, and most importantly, A timeline that aligned perfectly with the conversation they were now trying to have with me at dinner, as if it were spontaneous, as if it were reasonable. It was not spontaneous. It was scheduled. I closed the folder slowly, placing it back exactly as I had found it, my hands steady, my breathing even, because by then I understood something that changed everything. They were not reacting to circumstances. They were executing a plan. And the only reason it had worked so far was because I had trusted them enough not to look too closely. That would not happen again. Later that afternoon, Vanessa joined me in the living room, sitting across from me with that same composed posture, her tone gentle, almost concerned. "I hope you are not feeling overwhelmed by everything," she said, folding her hands in her lap as if this were a conversation about my well-being and not my removal. I looked at her for a moment, really looked at her, not as the woman who had entered this family years ago, but as the person she had revealed herself to be, and I offered a small, measured smile. "I am adjusting," I said simply. She nodded, satisfied with that answer, because to her, adjustment meant acceptance. To me, it meant preparation. Richard joined us shortly. After, standing near the doorway, watching the interaction with quiet expectation, as if waiting to see whether I would push back, whether I would complicate the path they had already cleared for themselves. I did not. I asked no questions. I made no objections. And in doing so, I gave them exactly what they needed to continue. Confidence. Because the truth they had not realized yet was simple. The moment I stopped reacting was the moment I started acting. And while they were still thinking about what they would take from me next, I was already deciding what they would not be able to keep. The following morning, I drove to a place I had not visited in years, a quiet brick building on the corner of Maple and 3rd, where the sign outside had not changed since the day Richard and I first walked in together decades ago, back when every decision we made carried both of our names with equal weight and equal trust. And as I parked my car, I sat for a moment with my hands resting on the steering wheel, not hesitating, not second-guessing, just acknowledging the quiet shift that had brought me here alone. Inside, the office smelled faintly of paper and polished wood, the kind of place where conversations were measured and words carried consequences, and when I gave my name at the front desk, the receptionist looked up with a polite smile that held no recognition, which was expected, because time moves differently for places like this, even when it changes everything for the people who walk through its doors. I was led into a small office where a man in his early 60s stood to greet me, introducing himself as Daniel Harper, his tone calm, professional, attentive without being intrusive, and as we sat across from each other, I noticed the way he waited, not rushing me, not assuming, simply allowing space for me to speak when I was ready. I placed my folder on the desk between us and opened it slowly, turning it toward him so he could see the documents without me needing to explain them all at once. "I believe there have been some changes made that I did not fully understand at the time," I said, my voice steady, clear, without accusation or emotion, just fact. He adjusted his glasses and began reading, his expression neutral at first, then gradually more focused, his attention sharpening with each page as the pattern revealed itself not through any single line, but through the accumulation of details that had been designed to seem ordinary. He asked a few questions, precise, direct, about dates, signatures, access, and I answered each one carefully, giving him exactly what he needed and nothing more. When he finally leaned back in his chair, there was a pause, not of uncertainty, but of consideration. "These changes," he said slowly, "they were structured to shift control over time, not all at once." I nodded. That was my understanding as well. He studied me for a moment, as if measuring something beyond the documents, perhaps expecting distress or anger, something that would fit the situation more visibly, but I offered him neither. "What would you like to do next?" he asked. I folded my hands in my lap, the same way I had done across dinner tables, in living rooms, in every space where I had been expected to listen more than speak, and I met his gaze without hesitation. "I would like to ensure that nothing further can be changed without my full and direct authorization," I said, "and I would like to understand exactly what options I have to protect what is still mine." He nodded once, decisively, already reaching for a notepad, already shifting from observation to action, and in that moment, something settled quietly into place, not relief, not satisfaction, but certainty. Because while Richard and Vanessa were still moving forward with a plan they believed was nearly complete, I had just taken the first step in a direction they had not accounted for. One that did not require confrontation or explanation, only precision and timing. When I left the office, the air outside felt different. Not lighter, not easier, but clearer. And as I got into my car and closed the door behind me, I allowed myself one small, controlled breath before starting the engine. They still believed I was behind them. They still believed I was unaware. And that belief was about to become the most important advantage I had. When I walked back into the house that evening, everything was exactly where I had left it. The same quiet living room, the same polished floors, the same photographs lining the hallway, but I no longer saw them as reminders of a shared life. I saw them as evidence of something I had built and something they believed they could quietly take. And that difference changed the way I moved through each room, not as someone holding on, but as someone preparing to reclaim. Vanessa was in the kitchen again, standing at the counter, her phone propped up as she followed a recipe she had likely never made before, humming softly as if this house already answered to her rhythm instead of mine. She looked up when I entered, her expression warm, welcoming, practiced to perfection. "You are back," she said, as if I had been expected to return, as if my presence was still something to be acknowledged rather than tolerated. I nodded, setting my keys down in the same place I always had, my movements calm, unhurried, predictable. "Traffic was light," I replied, offering nothing more. Richard joined us a moment later, his sleeves rolled up, his posture relaxed in a way that suggested comfort, not caution, and as he moved beside Vanessa, their proximity no longer attempted to hide itself. It simply existed, confident, unchallenged. "We were just talking about next week," he said, glancing at me briefly before looking back at her, figuring out some timelines. I met his gaze for a second, then looked away, as if the details did not concern me. "That sounds like a good idea," I said evenly. Vanessa smiled slightly, encouraged by the lack of resistance, and stepped closer to the table where a stack of papers had been placed neatly at one end, partially covered, but not enough to escape notice. "Nothing urgent," she added quickly, her tone light, almost reassuring. "Just organizing things." I walked over slowly, not reaching for the papers, not asking to see them, simply standing near enough to acknowledge their presence without claiming any authority over them. And in that small decision I could feel the shift again, the quiet confirmation that they believed I had already stepped aside. "I trust you will let me know when something needs my attention," I said, my voice soft, controlled, measured in a way that suggested compliance rather than awareness. Richard nodded, satisfied, his shoulders easing as if a potential obstacle had just removed itself without effort. "Of course," he replied. We sat down to eat shortly after, the conversation flowing around me, plans discussed in vague terms, references made to future arrangements that were never fully explained, because they did not think they needed to explain them to me anymore, and I listened carefully, not interrupting, not correcting, simply allowing them to reveal the structure of their plan piece by piece, each sentence adding clarity to what I had already begun to understand. When dinner ended, I stood and cleared my plate, moving toward the sink, my back to them, giving them space to speak more freely, and they did, their voices lowering just slightly, their words more direct now that they believed I was no longer part of the conversation, and that was when I heard it clearly, not a confession, not a slip, but a confirmation. "Once everything is signed, it will be easier," Vanessa said quietly. Richard responded with a short nod. "It is already in motion." I rinsed the plate in my hands, the water running steady, masking the silence that followed, and for the first time since this began, I allowed myself to recognize exactly where they thought the finish line was, and more importantly, how close they believed they were to reaching it. They thought the next step would end this. They were wrong. The next step was where it would begin. The next morning arrived with a kind of quiet precision that only comes when everything has already been decided, at least in the minds of those who believe they are in control, and as I walked into the kitchen, I found the table already set, not for breakfast, but for something else, something more deliberate, the stack of papers from the night before now fully visible, neatly arranged, accompanied by 2 pens placed side by side, as if the outcome had already been agreed upon. Vanessa stood near the window, her posture composed, her expression calm in a way that suggested anticipation rather than uncertainty, while Richard remained seated, flipping through the top page as though reviewing details that had already been finalized. "We thought it would be easier to go over everything this morning," he said, looking up at me briefly, his tone measured, careful, but not cautious enough. I nodded slowly, taking my usual seat, my hands resting lightly on the table, my gaze moving over the documents without reaching for them. "Of course," I replied, my voice steady, almost indifferent. Vanessa stepped forward slightly, placing one hand on the back of a chair, her presence close but not intrusive, her voice soft, guiding. "It is mostly just formalities," she said. "Things we have already discussed." I allowed a small pause before responding, just enough to suggest consideration without resistance. "Then I am sure it will be simple," I said. Richard pushed the top document toward me, turning it so it faced my direction, his fingers lingering for a second before pulling back, as if marking the exact moment he believed control would transfer completely. "This outlines the updated arrangements," he explained. "It is meant to make things more manageable going forward." I looked down at the paper, scanning the first few lines without urgency, without reaction, letting the silence stretch just long enough to draw their attention to my lack of hesitation. "And you believe this is necessary?" I said quietly. It was not a question. It was a confirmation. Vanessa answered before he could. "We believe it is the best option for everyone," she said, her tone firm beneath the softness. I nodded once, reaching for the pen, my fingers closing around it with the same calm precision I had carried through every step leading to this moment. For a second, neither of them spoke. They were watching me now, not for resistance but for completion, for the final act that would confirm everything they had planned. I lowered the pen to the page, letting the tip hover just above the line where my name was expected to appear, and in that exact moment, I lifted my eyes and met Richard's gaze fully, not with anger, not with accusation, but with something far more unsettling. "Clarity. Before I sign anything," I said, my voice even, controlled, "there is something you should know." The shift was immediate, subtle but undeniable. The air tightening, Vanessa's posture adjusting almost imperceptibly, Richard's expression changing just enough to reveal that this was not part of the script they had prepared. I set the pen down gently beside the paper instead of using it, folding my hands together as if the decision had already been made, just not in the way they expected. "I have already reviewed these documents," I continued, my tone calm, almost conversational. "Not just today, over the past few days." Silence followed, heavier now, no longer comfortable, no longer controlled by them. Richard frowned slightly, the first crack in his certainty. "What do you mean?" he asked. I held his gaze without blinking. "I mean that I understand exactly what you have been doing," I said, and for the first time since this began, I did not need to pretend I did not see them, because now it was their turn to realize they had been seen all along. I did not raise my voice after that, and I did not repeat myself, because the truth does not need to be louder to be understood. It only needs to be clear, and in that moment clarity was the one thing neither of them had prepared for. Richard leaned back slightly in his chair, his expression tightening in a way I had not seen in years. Not anger, not yet, but the beginning of uncertainty, the quiet realization that something had shifted beyond his control. Vanessa, on the other hand, remained very still, her composure holding for a few seconds longer, but I could see it in the way her fingers pressed lightly against the back of the chair, the way her eyes narrowed just enough to calculate, to reassess, to search for an angle that was no longer there. "You are misunderstanding," she said finally, her tone careful, measured, but lacking the confidence it had carried before. I shook my head once, slowly, not dismissing her, but correcting the assumption behind her words. "No," I said, my voice calm, steady. "I understand exactly." I reached for the folder I had brought with me and placed it gently on the table, sliding it forward just enough for Richard to see the familiar headings, the annotations, the dates that matched far too precisely to be coincidence. He did not touch it immediately. He only looked at it, and that hesitation told me everything. "These adjustments," I continued, "were not mistakes. They were steps." Vanessa straightened slightly, her voice sharpening just a fraction. "We were trying to make things easier for you," she said. I allowed a small pause, just long enough to let that statement settle in the space between us.
No, irraplia quietly.
You were trying to make things easier for yourselves. The silence that followed was different from all the others that had come before. This one was no longer comfortable, no longer controlled by them, and for the first time since this began, they were the ones without a script. Richard finally reached for the folder, flipping it open, scanning the pages more quickly than before, as if speed could change what was written there. Even if that were true, he said, his tone shifting now, defensive, strained. These documents still need to be signed. I looked at him steadily, not reacting to the tension in his voice, not engaging with the urgency he was trying to create. No, I said again, just as evenly, they do not. I placed my hands flat on the table, not in defiance, not in challenge, but in certainty. Because nothing further can be changed without my direct authorization anymore, I continued. And I have already ensured that. That was when the realization finally reached them, not all at once, but in fragments, in the way Richard's expression faltered, in the way Vanessa's posture lost its ease, in the way the confidence that had filled this room only minutes ago began to dissolve into something far less certain. What did you do? Richard asked, his voice lower now, no longer controlled, no longer rehearsed. I met his gaze without hesitation. I protected what was mine, I said simply. I stood then, not abruptly, not dramatically, just enough to signal that the conversation, at least from my side, was finished. The papers remained untouched. The pen remained where I had set it down. And for the first time since they had begun this plan, they were the ones left sitting, the ones left trying to understand how something they believed was already decided had just been taken completely out of their hands. I picked up my keys from the counter, the same place I had always left them, and walked toward the door without looking back, because I no longer needed to see their reactions to know exactly what they were feeling. They thought they had been planning ahead of me. They thought I had been standing still. What they never realized was that while they were busy moving pieces quietly in the background, I had been watching, learning, and waiting. And in the end, I did not need to stop them. I only needed to let them believe they were winning long enough for them to lose everything on their own.